As the war and possible solutions to it are discussed in other parts of the world, the results of the North Vietnamese offensive are an unforgettable reality here in South Vietnam. Long after the fighting stops, as it surely eventually will, all of this will remain part of the long heritage of the Vietnam War. Ron Miller, ABC News, Michon.
The Vietnam War began on November 1st in 1955. French-educated Emperor Bao Dai took over Vietnam at the conclusion of World War II. Political leader of Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, overthrew Dai and took over the northern city of Hanoi, officially declaring a Democratic Republic of Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh as the president. French-aided Emperor Bao setting up the state of Vietnam in July of 1949, with the city of Saigon as its capital. Although both sides attempted to unify Vietnam, Minh and Bao approached the goal in different ways. While Minh desired to shape Vietnam into a communist country similar to China and the Soviet Union, Bao wanted to model their economy and culture after the West. After the decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954, it ended in the victory for Minh's forces against the South. The negotiations resulted in Vietnam being split into two along the 17th parallel. Minh took control of North and Bao controlled the South. Also, the treaty called for nationwide elections for reunification to be held in 1956. However, the strongly anti-communist politician Nha Dien Diem persuaded Emperor Bao to attain the position of president to the government of the Republic of Vietnam. As the Cold War began to escalate, the United States began to create more policies directed to oppose allies of the Soviet Union. And by 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower pledged his support towards Diem in southern Vietnam. By 1957, opponents of Diem started to retaliate by attacking government officials and other targets, and by 1959 they began to have firefights with South Vietnam. In December 1960, Diem's many opponents within southern Vietnam created the National Liberation Force to organize resistance to the regime. However, the war escalated with a coup of Diem's own generals killing him 3 weeks before President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was forced to handle the political instability in South Vietnam, consequently increasing U.S. military and economic support. The Vietnamese responded in August of 1964, attacking 2 U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. To combat the Vietnamese efforts, Johnson issued the bombardment of military targets in North Vietnam, and the United States became involved in the war. As the war progressed, more troops were deployed in Vietnam. By June of 1965, 82,000 combat troops were stationed in Vietnam, and by the end of 1965, military leaders in South Vietnam called for an additional 175,000 soldiers to aid in the struggle. Under President Nixon's presidency, he sought to deflate the tension with Vietnam implementing the policy of Vietnamization. The policy had the plan to limit the amount of American casualties which would be prevented by withdrawing U.S. troops, increasing aerial and artillery bombardment, and training the South Vietnamese. The attempt to reduce U.S. intervention proved to be futile, though. Within the next few years, the U.S. soldiers within the village of My Lai slaughtered more than 400 unarmed civilians in March of 1968.
If there are any conclusions to be drawn from this pre-dawn attack, it's this: that the North Vietnamese are capable of coming through South Vietnamese lines like a sieve. Jim Bennett, ABC News, Ben Cat.
After the My Lai massacre, the anti-war protests continued to spread their influence in hopes of ending American intervention. The anti-war movement was particularly strong on college campuses, for the youth saw the war as a symbol of unchecked power, which they had come to resent. The protests were further agitated by the casualties reaching 15,058 killed and 109,527 being wounded by November of 1967. Along with the public losing trust in their government, the soldiers participating in the war began to question the repeated claims that the war was being won. The U.S. military experienced more than 503,000 personnel desertions between July of 1966 and December of 1973. This spurred a large anti-war movement along American forces, which became violent through the killing and mass incarceration of personnel stationed in Vietnam and the United States. The American public was also exposed to the horrific images of war through the television. The built-up tension caused more than 35,000 protesters to stage a massive Vietnam War protest outside the Pentagon in October of 1967. The protest was in response to the invasion of Cambodia to destroy DRV supply bases. The invasion of Laos was also a cause to these protests. The Cambodian campaign was a series of military operations conducted in eastern Cambodia during 1970 by the United States and the Republic of Vietnam as part of the Vietnam War and the Cambodian Civil War. The invasion were policies implemented by President Richard Nixon. The objective of the campaign was to defeat 40,000 troops of the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong in the eastern border regions of Cambodia. Cambodian neutrality and military weakness made its territory a safe zone where Vietnamese Communist forces could establish bases for operations over the border. With the U.S. shifting toward a policy of Vietnamization and withdrawal, it sought to shore up the Vietnamese government by eliminating the cross-border threat. The surprise bombing angered many people, and the protests against the war grew stronger.
Headley's off tonight. I'm David Brinkley, NBC News. Kent State University in Ohio has had campus violence for 3 nights, causing the National Guard to be called in. And today the guardsmen opened fire on the students, killing 4 of them, 2 young men and 2 young women. 3 were shot in the chest and 1 in the head. A dozen or more others were wounded, some by gunfire and some by bayonets. The university is closed and all faculty and students have been sent home. The students were protesting the American invasion of Cambodia.
On May 4th, 1970, a fatal day came and 4 students were killed, along with 9 that were injured in a protest at Kent State that was interrupted by the National Guard. The students were protesting the United States bombings of Cambodia and had held protests on days previous to that. On May 1st through May 3rd, rallies were held on Kent State in the town of Kent, Ohio. The protests were gaining national awareness for the disturbance that they were causing to the surrounding area. Protesters were starting fires and had plans to throw rocks at any enforcement that attempted to stop them. Beer bottles were thrown at police, bonfires were started in the streets, and there were many rumors of plans to destroy the ROTC building on Kent State property. Some claims about the protests even went as far to say that the water supply would be contaminated with LSD, a psychedelic drug. Many of the backlash that went against the protesters were war supporters looking for an outlet to criticize draft dodgers and those that were disagreeing with the war. Although the protests were getting out of control, the arguments stemmed around it were a channel for war supporters and pro-peace believers to dispute a deeper cause. After 3 eventful protests, another was scheduled for noon on Monday, May 4th. Students were planning to meet on the university's commons, and it was planned to be the largest protest yet. Despite Kent State's efforts to stop the protest by handing out leaflets saying it was canceled, over 2,000 students showed up. The only purpose of the protest was to voice anger over the bombings in Cambodia and the United States' involvement in the war, not to begin an attack. The National Guard and other enforcements were there from the start of the protests and tried to disperse the large crowds from beginning. After it was apparent that the crowd would not disperse, the National Guard took to foot with guns and gas masks and advanced on the crowd. They were met with the chant, "Pigs off campus." When the protesters moved away from the guns, the National Guard followed up until they were stopped by a fence and had nowhere to move. Although many of the protesters had left by then, the radicals within the group began to approach the National Guard because they still wanted any type of enforcement to be off the campus. The National Guard began to move back towards the commons while looking back to ensure that they were not being attacked. On their walk back to the commons, Myron Pryor turned around and began to fire upon the crowd. 22 other guardsmen joined, and 67 rounds of ammunition were blindly fired into the crowd over the course of less than a minute. The guards claimed that they were fired upon by a sniper, and the truth of this statement remains up to debate. It appears to be rather odd that a protest arguing peace would use guns to attack their oppressors, when they knew it would only lead the National Guard to shoot upon the crowd. There were also 77 guardsmen present, and 1 sniper bullet would not have resolved the issue. Of the 4 students killed and 9 wounded, none were closer than 71 feet. The students were not close enough to be a direct threat, and the guards would be criticized for their lack of judgment in the shooting of the students. Some of those hit by bullets were not even in the protest and were only walking between classes. Although there was violence and lack of judgment on the side of the protesters, the guards should not have shot into the crowd and hurt so many people. The story soon spread to the public along with graphic images of those that were shot. There was an immediate cultural and political response to the massacre, and the issues in the protesting war only became more relevant.
We are standing on the The immediate response to the shootings were very significant. The first nationwide school protests were held 4 days after the shootings and included a total of over 4 million students in over 450 campuses. Kent State was closed for 6 weeks after the shooting, but it had made its impact. The pictures taken of the killed and wounded students quickly spread throughout newspapers and became infamous worldwide. The most important picture was taken by John Philo, a Kent State photojournalism student, of 20-year-old Jeffrey Miller's body as 14-year-old Mary Ann Vicho is shown screaming over him. Pictures like this motivated hundreds of thousands of students to demonstrate both against the war in violent and nonviolent protests. While a majority were nonviolent, the ones where violence broke out were publicated more and only further divided the people. On May 8th, 11 student protesters were injured by the New Mexico National Guard at the University of New Mexico. On the same day, another anti-Vietnam War protest in New York's Federal Hall, a national memorial, was met by a counter-protest of pro-Nixon workers in the Hard Hat riot and resulted in over 70 injuries between both participants. A famous banner was hung by New York University students that read, "They can't kill us all," and was expressed by many students during the time. Some students were disowned by their families upon returning home, and some said they'd wish more students would have died to show the protesters lessons. The public were very polarized over the shootings, and when a poll was taken by Gallup to determine who would be blamed for the incident, 58% blamed the students, 11% blamed the National Guard, and 31% had no opinion. Many students and even newspapers began to refer to the shooting as a massacre in comparison to the Boston Massacre of 1770. The biggest protest was held on May 9th at Washington, D.C., with over 100,000 people to protest the Kent State shootings and the Vietnam War. While many of the protests were meant to be nonviolent, Ray Price, Nixon's chief speechwriter, described the D.C. protesters smashing windows, slashing tires, and dragging cars into intersections, and even called it a state of civil war. President Nixon had to be taken to Camp David for his protection, and the military had to be called in case it escalated further. On May 9th, Nixon met with 30 students having a vigil at the Lincoln Memorial in an attempt to reach to the protesters.
Probably most of you think I'm an SOB, but I want you to know that I understand just how you feel.
Some argued the meeting only further divided the two sides. Nixon is also allegedly claimed after the meeting that the students were pawns to foreign communists. Nixon also had ideas to enact the Huston Plan, which called for using more illegal ways to obtaining information of the leaders of the anti-war movements, but never came to fruition.
Spoke up, said, I hope you realize that we're willing to die for what we believe in. I said, I certainly realize that. My goals in Vietnam were the same as theirs, to stop the killing. But this time, the dawn was upon us, and I said I had to go. I said, I just hope your opposition doesn't turn into a blind hatred of the country.
Kent State was not the only incident, however. On May 14th, 2 students were killed and 12 wounded at Jackson State University in protest of Kent State, but it did not get nearly as much attention as Kent State did. On June 13th, 1970, Nixon, after receiving more and more criticism, he established the President's Commission on Campus Unrest to study the dissent, disorder, and violence from student protests. On September 1970, the President's Commission conducted a study of the Kent State and Jackson State killings and found that the killings were unjustified because although the guardsmen could have faced danger, it was not a danger that called for force, and no order was given to fire, and the guards had not learned proper crowd and fire control. Many people still believe the students were at fault, and the counter-protesters would only support Nixon stronger and would be a reason for his re-election in 1972. The activism from students had a bigger impact because in 1970, the U.S. would begin its slow withdrawal from Vietnam. The Kent State shooting, along with the protests that followed, caused great division between the American public because of the U.S.'s foreign policy of containment and being involved in a foreign war.